Welcome to this edition of our weekly webinar series, sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China, which I am very proud to be the vice chairman. My name is Frank Gaffney. We are presenting to you a very special program today in which we are really going to feature one presenter to offer a detailed briefing on a subject that I think has been evident for quite some time, but until she really put her finger on it and characterized it, for me, extremely helpfully on Steve Bannon's War Room program recently, it hadn't quite clicked. And it seemed to me that it warranted a deeper dive. So we'll be talking about that presenter and her briefing, as well as our other guests in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to just bring you up to speed on a very important development in just the past 24 hours. We've been championing, as I suspect you know, if you are a subscriber to these programs or otherwise familiar with the work of the organization that makes them possible, the Committee on the Present Danger China, all of which can be facilitated by your visiting presentdangerchina.org. The committee has had as a very important focus of effort from its inception about 7 years ago now, the idea of doing something material to defeat the Chinese Communist Party, taking a page really out of the playbook of my old boss, Ronald Reagan, who was able to engineer the takedown of the Soviet Communist Party by going after, among other things, but very importantly, its hard currency cash flow. This was a strategy that was articulated and facilitated by one of his subordinates on the National Security Council at the time, Roger Robinson. Roger has been a guest on these webinars on numerous occasions. He was at the time in the Reagan administration the senior director for international economic affairs. And he helped really devise, as I say, the means by which President Reagan could implement his strategy that he famously called, "We win, they lose," by essentially making it impossible for the Soviets to sustain their military activities, their political warfare and other stratagems. Indeed, the party's hold on power. As Roger is fond of saying, it was no accident that one day after they declared bankruptcy, the Soviets announced the end of the evil empire. We are very appreciative that Roger Robinson has, in most of the years since, devoted himself to addressing a similar and indeed arguably vastly greater threat that we currently face from the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party's counterpart, much more shrewd, much more skillful, and much more successful, specifically in accomplishing something that eluded the Soviets, namely to make the United States, and specifically Wall Street, and most especially its clients, institutional and retail investors, in the underwriting of not only the operations of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, but also their spectacular buildup militarily and in other ways. The Belt and Road Initiative, about which we'll be speaking in due course in this webinar, about the political warfare and other lines of attack that make up, when taken together, the Chinese unrestricted warfare against our country. I wanted to just mention that yesterday, as we speak, Roger Robinson was featured on Maria Bartiromo's program on Fox Business, in the course of which he talked at length about this problem of our underwriting our mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party, through its various companies that are now on Wall Street or otherwise packaged in things like exchange traded funds and index funds and mutual funds and other investment vehicles. Roger also mentioned in the course of this important conversation, and I commend it to all of you, it will be located on our Committee on the Present Danger China website here in a little bit. But the specific focus of that conversation was the imminent introduction of a Hong Kong initial public offering of a company known by its acronym as CATL, or CATL, if you will, CATL. This company has recently been sanctioned by the Defense Department for its work supporting the People's Liberation Army's artificial intelligence weaponization. It happens that it has also been deeply involved with another Chinese company responsible for running basically the Chinese gulag, the concentration camps and the like. It's called the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. It's essentially the means by which the genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is being operated. And CATL is a great enabler of that with its electric batteries and other capabilities. The point is, unless something is done about this, American investors are going to find they have CATL in their portfolios, which is a material risk to the investor. It's also, I believe, a strategic risk to our nation. By some estimates, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, the US banks that are bringing this IPO to the United States, hope to raise $7 billion for this Chinese military civil fusion company. Depending on demand, they may raise as much as 2 to 3 times that amount. And again, that money is going to go straight into the financial bloodstream, if you will, of the Chinese Communist Party. We think this is a terrible idea, but more importantly, it is utterly at odds with President Trump's recent national security presidential memorandum, which he announced the America First investment policy. Our view at the Committee on the Present Danger China is we need no more of a China First investment policy from the sponsors of this IPO and from the companies like CATL that are being brought into the portfolios, as I say, of mostly unwitting American investors. We call on President Trump to block this new entrant into our capital markets, to spare investors the risks associated with it, and to spare the country the further embroiling in the enabling of a People's Liberation Army that has its sights set on not just our military men and women, but on every American. So let me get back to the business at hand. The concluding and segueing comment is, Wall Street is doing this because it is what the Chinese communists call a captured elite. It has been corrupted by various commercial arrangements, commissions, retainers, what have you. And it has implicated by some estimates, over 100 million investors. It is happening here, but the playbook, the political warfare, the United Front Work Department, the co-option, the corruption, is very much the focus of today's topic. What is happening in what our main presenter calls the Pacific Heartland? And what will that mean for our heartland here in the United States, as well as others around the world, notably Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Guam, Hawaii, others in the region, as well as I say, in the continental United States and points further east, Europe and beyond. We're going to get to that main presenter in just a moment. Before we do, I will just say a word of very brief introduction because he's a regular on these programs. We're Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. Jim Fennell finished his distinguished career in naval intelligence as the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He's these days with the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where he's a senior fellow. He's the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer of a really important best-selling book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. We were able to catch up with him in connection with an interview I did yesterday for our show, Securing America, and he gave us some very important introductory remarks to today's special presentation. Let's go to the video with Captain Fennell now.
At the strategic level, we're facing the Chinese Communist Party, who is dedicated to essentially taking over global control of the world and displacing the United States. If they can do that without firing a shot, they prefer to do that, and they've been able to take lots of territory that way. They took Hong Kong recently, they're controlling Xinjiang, they took Tibet by force many, many years ago, but they control it now, and they're taking over the United Nations, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization. They're trying to displace our currency. They got problems, but that's their goal, and part of that goal is to make sure that they have the military wherewithal and capabilities to be able to achieve what they want if they can't get it through non-kinetic coercive measures like political warfare and things of that nature, and economic warfare. And so they've been building up for the last 25 or more years a military that's designed to help them achieve some of their goals. And the first goal for them, obviously, is to restore what they believe is their territorial integrity. And that includes, obviously, Taiwan. We've seen them over the last decade take control of the South China Sea, building 7 islands down there that are, they told us were just going to be islands, but then turned into military installations after they said they wouldn't. These are 3 of them are really key. They're the size of Pearl Harbor in terms of pier space and runways and things of that nature. They're threatening our allies and friends in Japan, in the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, and the lower Ryukyus, the Nansei Shoto. They're causing Korea to be, North Korea, to be a bad actor and in helping them in their missile program. But first and foremost, they've built a military that is designed to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet and the United States Navy. And they've done that through all domains, building an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability in space, building communication satellites that can relay that critical time targeting information to the shooters, if you will. They've built a strategic rocket force that's got missile systems that can rain down and threaten our fleet inside the first island chain and through the second island chain with the DF-21D and then the DF-26. And then they've equipped their ships, their submarines, and their aircraft with anti-ship cruise missiles, sea-skimming, hypersonic, supersonic, long-range, 200 to 300 kilometer range, longer than anything that the U.S. has. And they've invested that in a way to basically say they're going to try to dominate everything inside the first island chain and keep us from being able to come in and defend Taiwan or defend our rights and interests in that region, and to disrupt what we have created since the end of World War II. And they've gone in a period of, just a decade, they've gone from no aircraft carriers to 3 aircraft carriers. They've gone from 0 cruisers. Now they have 10 cruisers that are in the water, 8 operational, 2 will probably be operational this next year in 2025. They've gone from no amphibious assault carriers, and now they have four of the type 075 and one of the type 076. They've gone from one ballistic missile submarine that was a kind of a relic from technology that was given to them from the Russians, the Ja class, that only test fired a missile once back in 1981, to now having over 6 SSBNs of the Jin class that are equipped with the JL-3 submerged launch ballistic missile that has a range of close to 15,000 kilometers. It can range much of America from inside the first island chain or the South China Sea. They've built the fast attack submarines to escort and protect those ballistic missile submarines. They've built up bastion areas in the South China Sea. That's part of the reason for those islands down there, so that they can have sanctuary to be able to launch assured strikes against America with nuclear weapons. And they've been engaging in other kinds of warfare for us, sending people across our border and bringing in fentanyl that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans over the last few years. And what you have from the American elite, the national security community, was basically 20 plus years of denying that this was happening. And now, since Trump's first administration, that veneer of engagement would have them become like us. That was taken off in 2017. And now you're starting to see more recognition of it and the need for a larger military presence in the Pacific. The Central Pacific Islands, which Cleo will speak about, they're central to this, as they were 80 plus years ago in World War II. Japan in that time basically invaded with military forces. That was their lead-in to places like the Solomons or Tarawa, which is Kiribati today, and the other areas. The Japanese came in with their Imperial Japanese Navy and their army, and they took control militarily. What we've seen over the last decade is China moving in with soft power and basically taking advantage of American and Australian and New Zealand neglect. We kind of presumed that we would have this kind of relationship with these islands, and they would stay allied with us, and we wouldn't have to do much. And what's happened is that we neglected them, and China has put attention on them and has now gained footholds in several of the islands throughout these the Central and South Pacific. And China now is a valued economic trading partner. They're helping with security forces for police things like we see in the Solomons. They're setting up Belt and Road Initiative deals, and they're cementing their position in these critical islands that, if left unchecked and unremarked by the United States in the time of a conflict, they would be able to cut America off essentially from any and all trade with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, natural resources. And it would be bad for those countries, it would be bad for us. And if we were to then have to worry about fighting a kinetic war to try to defend the 23, 24 million people in Taiwan or millions more in Japan, we would be in a militarily disadvantaged position because we wouldn't have the access to operate naval and air and marine forces from those islands like we did so long ago. And we'd have to go back and fight and retake the same land that we did at Tarawa and Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and these kind of places. And this is the real perniciousness of what's happened in this last 30 years when we failed to look and prepare for the Pacific threat, that we ignored what we had paid in blood in World War II and recognized that we needed to defend that. And that meant investing and spending time and making sure that we were keeping our allies and friends in those islands with viable economies that were mutually beneficial to the United States and their countries. And we kind of ignored them and took them for granted, and we put them on some kind of welfare status, if you will. And they're rightly now concerned that if the welfare checks don't come, then they're going to go look for help and assistance from the Chinese Communist Party, who's more than willing to give them help without strings attached, so that they can then use those places as jumping off points to be able to attack the United States.
Captain Fennell, thank you for an excellent introduction to today's topic. We're going to, I believe, hear a considerable expansion on his closing point, that we as a nation, the persons of Marines and naval personnel and many others, including allies, bled and died to retake, and hold critical parts of the Central Pacific Islands that are now very much under assault by the Chinese Communist Party's political warfare activities. And much as with our own Wall Street, real inroads have been made. And our next presenter has made it her life's work to both understand the strategic importance of the Pacific Islands, the Indo-Pacific Islands, I think more accurately, as well as the incredibly high stakes if we fail to learn the lessons of history, then we are doomed to repeat at great cost the corrective actions that are assuredly going to be required if we're capable of them. That presenter, at long last, I'm pleased to introduce, is Cleo Pascal. I call her Cleo Pascal, but I think she pronounces it Cleo Pascal. Whatever she calls it is fine with me, as is basically everything else she says. I have been so tremendously impressed by her grasp of these issues, her deep personal knowledge of the terrain, I guess you could call it, but it's actually mostly seascape, dotted by strategic islands in three distinct chains in the Western Pacific, from north to south. Cleo is a non-resident senior fellow at a terrific organization, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. She is a columnist for the Indian Sunday Guardian, and I'm thrilled to be able to say we are going to get today a sneak preview, if you will, on testimony that she will be giving before an important commission established by Congress. That would be the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which she will deliver her remarks to on Thursday, the 20th, next week. So without further ado, we've asked Cleo to depart from our usual format of making basically truncated remarks, to give her the time to really develop in some detail just what's on the line, and to give you an in-depth understanding of just how important is the Pacific Heartland to the future viability of our own here at home. Cleo, welcome back. It's good to have you. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for focusing on the topic. At least according to the CCP, my last name rhymes with rascal, so if you can call me Theo, that's helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about this very vast region, and I'm going to go back beyond World War II. We sort of know the story of World War II, but the U.S. in the Pacific before World War II really sets the stage for understanding how important this has been to the U.S. for at least 2 centuries. And it's going to, I hope, help a little bit decolonize the mental strategic map that we have. A big part of the problem is that the American strategic community is literally uses a Eurocentric map. So Oleg, if we could put up that first map, please. So if you went to school at a time when there were actual maps up on the wall, you might have thought it was North America centered, but it was actually centered on Europe, and the dominant ocean was the Atlantic. This is National Geographic's map, not the Royal Geographical Society, but U.S. National Geographic's map. As you can see, it's actually Europe that's physically at the center of the map, and the dominant ocean is the Atlantic Ocean. And in many ways, that's shaped our way of looking at the world. The Pacific is literally at the edges of the map. It's hard to understand how it bridges North America to Asia or what's in that Pacific. It sort of shaped us, and we see it also in strategic thought. If you've done any courses on the history of geopolitics or anything like that, you'll be very familiar with the next map. Next one, please, which is Mackinder's geographical pivot of history. This theory, the heartland theory, is that whoever controls that pivot area, which is basically the kind of the Volga to the Yangtze to the Arctic to the Himalayas, controls what Mackinder called the world island. Now, the world island was Europe, Asia, and Africa. The idea was that that pivot area controlled 50% of resources known at the time. This dates from 1904. And so engagement in that area, control in that area was critical for controlling the direction of the world. He called it that region the geographical pivot of history. Whoever had control over that area could expand out from there and have extensive control. There are a few things from a North American perspective and from a modern perspective that don't quite make sense. First of all, as you can see, North America isn't really considered that critical. It's part of this outer crescent. But also, there was an assumption that what was behind the pivot was what Mackinder called an icy wall. So that area was backed up against something that nobody could get at them from. The Arctic was not considered strategically important. And we saw that during the Russo-Japanese War around the same time, 1904, 1905, the Baltic Fleet had to get from Russia to Japan, and it had to go west past the UK, down the Horn of Africa, and then all the way along in order to get to Japan. It took about 8 or 9 months to get to Japan. By the time this fleet got there, it was covered in barnacles, the men were exhausted, and they were destroyed very quickly. Now, you can, during certain times of the year, and depending on on your naval assets, you can get across the Pacific from that area, from the Russian Arctic, very quickly into the Northern Pacific. So it's changed that part of the strategic map. But this is still, you will still hear people talk about the geographical pivot of history, Mackinder's heartland, how important it is. But it's a very Eurocentric view. This is important to Europe. It's not necessarily important to America. And America knew it from very early on. Next slide, please. In 1938 to 1942, the U.S. sent out an exploring expedition. It's also known as the XX, and it collected samples and did ethnographic studies. It discovered Antarctic. We hear a lot about Cook's voyages and a lot of those European voyages of discovery, but this was an extraordinary American one that was one of the biggest of the area, and its goal was to understand the Pacific. And so a lot of the samples from that expedition ended up in the Smithsonian, and this is a quote from Smithsonian Magazine. Besides establishing a stronger diplomatic presence throughout the Pacific, the expedition sought to provide much-needed charts to American whalers, sealers, and China traders. Decades before America surveyed and mapped its own interior, this government-sponsored voyage of discovery would enable a new determined nation to take its first tentative steps towards becoming an economic world power. There was understanding that the economic future of the United States was in the Pacific, understanding and being comfortable in the Pacific. Next slide, please. And you saw the development that going there, the sort of push of manifest destiny didn't stop at the Western coast. And there was a very quick development in the 19th century. So California was admitted as a state in 1850, Alaska was purchased in 1867, Transcontinental Railway was completed in 69, Hawaii was annexed in 1898, and then the Spanish-American War came also in 1898, where the United States took possession of the Philippines and Guam. This is a particularly interesting, the Spanish-American War is critically important for understanding what the U.S. wasn't. When the U.S. beat Spain, it took the Philippines and it took Guam, but there was a whole series of other islands in the Pacific that belonged to Spain, including the Caroline Islands, parts of what's now the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. And the U.S. didn't take it. The U.S. wanted what it needed for logistical reach and trade primarily, which was the issue with, partially with the Philippines. But it didn't want to become the sort of colonial power that was developing at the time. So those islands that the U.S. didn't take, Spain sold to Germany, which was very much of a colonial power. This is the map of U.S. possessions from around that period. And you can see they're kind of scattered all the way across, mostly small, including, by the way, the excellent harbor at Pago Pago in American Samoa. But it wasn't, except for the Philippines, it's this sort of attempt to colonially grab the whole heart of it. And the importance of all of this was reinforced, next slide, please, when Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet into the Pacific. And he said, in my own judgment, the most important service that I rendered to peace was the voyage of the battle fleet around the world. I had become convinced that for many reasons it was essential that we should have it clearly understood by our own people especially, but also by other peoples, that the Pacific was as much our home waters as the Atlantic. So this understanding of the importance of the Pacific, I mean, it's 200 years old as you go, from the XX, you know that, but President Roosevelt made it very clear. And if you look at the route of the Great White Fleet, he stopped at all these places which had just become part of America. Hawaii, Pago Pago, Australia, New Zealand, but then Philippines and on up. It was really kind of saying, we're here to stay. Then World War I came. And if you remember, I mentioned that Spain sold some of its territories to the Germans. And what happened during World War I was the Japanese moved in and took those German possessions. Next slide, please. And so you had a situation, this is a little bit maybe unclear for some people to see, but where you had the United States in sort of the top right, that's the Hawaiian Islands, and you had the United States over to the left with the Philippines. But in between the Philippines and the United States was this massive Japanese mandate in the Central Pacific. So it expanded down from Japan through that whole Central Pacific area. So that's now what is Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. Those were places the U.S. did not take in the Spanish-American War, but Japan did, and it set up to colonize them. It set up to make them part of Japan. So the civilian headquarters for that region was Koror. It had more Japanese than Palauans living there. There were schools, health clinics, a lot of economic development. It became very much part of Japan, and it was closed largely to the outside world. But there was a lot of concern that this could become a strategic problem. For example, Pete Ellis from the Marines went to Palau to go take a look. He went across the region and he wrote what became the basis for the island hopping campaign. But he did that in the early 20s. So 20 years before the war started, people knew that this was going to be a problem. And at the same time, Billy Mitchell was in the 30s, was up in Alaska saying Alaska is going to be critical also. And when I talk about the Pacific, I am including that whole center from the Aleutians down through the Central Pacific to argue that if the U.S. doesn't have at least strategic denial over that area, it is at risk. And we saw that in World War II. Next slide, please. So what happened in World War II was Japan could hit the U.S. from that core, that center of the Pacific, that heartland of this geopolitical pivot. And the U.S. had a very hard time getting to Japan because it had the buffer of the Central Pacific, and the U.S. military had to come down through the south and fight its way back up through what Captain Fennell was describing, the battles of Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, Tarawa, Macon, to finally get to the Japanese-held territories in what's now Marshall Islands, Kwajalein, Federated States of Micronesia, Truk Lagoon, Peleliu, and Palau, and then work towards Saipan, which is Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and then finally be able to set up the airfields in Tinian in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, where the waves of B-29s could go off and hit Japan. And ultimately, it was a B-29, the Enola Gay, that took off from Tinian and dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and started the process of the end of the war. Japan knew as soon as it lost Saipan that the U.S. was within striking distance, and it was considered its inner defense perimeter, and it was probably heading towards the end. The understanding of the importance of the control over that region, or at least strategic denial, and the cost that it took in human lives and in suffering of the locals was tremendous. I would argue just because there was a misunderstanding of the importance of the center of the map. Next slide, please. After the war, the exact same area that was the Japanese mandate reverted to the UN, and the UN Security Council gave it to the United States, specifically the Navy, to administer as the only strategic trust territory. As you can see from the map in the upper left-hand corner, it covers an area that's almost the size of the continental United States, very large. The U.S., again, it really is an uncomfortable colonial power. And in the 60s, it set up the Congress of Micronesia with representatives from across the region, local representatives, so that they could discuss how to move forward. But the underlying red line for the U.S. was this region cannot be in a position again where a hostile power can use it to hit the U.S. The negotiations went ahead, and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas decided to join the United States. So next slide, please. So this is the current map. Everything in dark blue is what currently belongs to the United States, including the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is to the left and just above Guam. And you can see that's where the US and Japan share a maritime boundary. That's how far into the Pacific the United States is. The CNMI, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, is the closest U.S. location to China. It's about 1,600 miles from China, and obviously kind of even closer to Taiwan. The rest of that zone, what became those three countries, next slide, please, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, they became independent, but they entered into this agreement with the U.S., which is unlike anything the U.S. has ever agreed before. It was agreed on the U.S. side because it didn't want to be a colonial power, but it also couldn't afford any other hostile control in the area. So these three countries entered into what's called the Compact of, each of them have their own Compact of Free Association with the United States. Next slide, please. It has a lot of elements to it, but for what we're talking about, this was the core of it. Independent countries, but the government of the United States has full authority and responsibility for security and defense matters in or relating to Marshall Islands, the Federal States of Micronesia, and Palau. So this is how the U.S. got the strategic denial that in the center of the Pacific, that if it had had it before World War II, history might have gone a very different way. So the men and women who negotiated this on both sides, because the people of those locations also didn't want to become a battlefield again, made this incredible complex agreement to try to secure the center of the Pacific. Next slide, please. This agreement it's really unique. So people they're called the freely associated states, these three countries. They can live and work in the U.S. without a problem, as long as they don't have criminal issues. They can and do at very high rates serve in the U.S. military. This picture is a picture of the post office in Koror and Palau. Remember, it's an independent country, but it has the U.S. flag at the same size as the Palauan flag because it is considered domestic mail. And one of my concerns actually with what's happening with Doge and the post office is somebody might not understand how important this element of post office support to the region is, because this is what enables them, for example, to order off Amazon, to send packages back and forth with relatives. It is the post office is an incredibly important symbol of that linkage between the U.S. and these three U.S. freely associated states. So that's something to keep an eye on. Their school system is synchronized to the U.S. system, so moving back and forth makes it a lot easier for the families and students. They can study at U.S. state universities at in-state rates. Their appliances have U.S. voltages and plugs. They're not members of the Commonwealth. They use American spelling. They drive on the right. They have access to U.S. weather services, FAA, and other government services. And again, as those are being cut or adjusted, awareness of what this might do in the FAS is going to be incredibly important. No other countries in the world have this sort of thing, and certainly not in the Pacific. So when we talk about the Pacific Islands, these three countries are totally different. And as Captain Fennell said, this was a relationship bought in blood and out of respect for the people of those countries that suffered the last time around, and this time it's essential to make sure that persists. A peculiarity of this is that all of this is under the Department of the Interior, which is why it's interesting because Secretary Burgum, who's Secretary of Interior now, is on the NSC because of the energy security. And it would be perhaps very helpful if his role was expanded to include oversight over the relationship between the U.S. territories of Guam and CNMI and the FAS, and to ensure that Chinese activities there aren't undermining U.S. strategic interests. That office, Secretary of the Interior, is actually the front line of defending U.S. strategic interests and the relationships with the countries of the Central Pacific. He's already on the NSC. It would be great if that could be expanded to include preserving and protecting this relationship and promoting this relationship. Next slide, please. If you take a look at the strategic map, a very traditional kinetic map, if you're a planner sitting in Indo-PACOM, for example, or the Pentagon, you look at this, you've got all these U.S. territories in dark blue. You've got the freely associated states in a little bit lighter. 2 out of the 3 of them recognize Taiwan, which gives them an added layer of protection. That means there's no Chinese embassy, so no Chinese forward operating location. And then you've got this turquoise color that is the defense, the treaty allies. So it looks like you're okay. Next slide, please. And Mr. Gaffney talked about the first and second, and then of course there's a third island chain that we talk about a lot, these north-south chains. But actually, if you look at it sort of how we're looking at it here, and you understand that it's the Central Pacific that's important, it's this east-west corridor of freedom, including freedom of navigation, that allows you to get to the first and second island chain that are what's critically important. And this was the problem that the U.S. had in the lead up to World War II. It had also focused off the coast of Asia. It had focused on Philippines and Guam were fine without realizing that, oh, that whole center of the Pacific is not fine, and being able to get to Philippines and Guam isn't going to be possible. So they're going to suffer several years of horrific occupation. But that was corrected after the war through these compacts of free association. And if you're a planner, you seem like you're okay. However, next slide, please. China also is very concerned about the first and second island chain. And this is from the PLA Navy handbook from around 15 years ago. They're very focused on it. So what they've been doing is, okay, we understand the US kinetic map. We fight in a different way. We use unrestricted warfare. We're going to use all sorts of agreements and elite capture and strategic corruption to gain influence within countries and to be in a position to basically hop the chain and do what the U.S. did during World War II. During World War II, in the kinetic map, the center of the Pacific was too hard for the U.S. So the U.S. had to come up through the bottom and then come hit it from behind as it was trying to degrade it internally. The Chinese are doing the same thing. And there's a very good paper by Toshi Yoshihara about how the PLA has studied the World War II maps and the US and Japan and have learned and adapted from it. Next slide, please. So in 2022, while we had this blue kinetic map and everything looked fine, during COVID, Wang Yi went to visit the region with some agreements, and these are the countries in red where all of the restrictions that had been in place since the start of COVID were dropped just to let him come in, him and his delegation come in. To me, that's a proxy for understanding how much influence they had to get them to not only to want to, but to get them to drop their health restrictions that people couldn't come home for funerals. But Wang Yi could come in for a 2-day photo op and talking to people in these countries. So you can see through all of the things that Mr. Gaffney and Captain Fennell talked about, this kind of strategic corruption, they got right in and they've jumped the first and second island chain. Next slide, please. So just to give you kind of a visual for it, this is the view from Mount Tapachao. A lot of Marines died in order to recapture or capture Mount Tapachao from Japanese forces. And when you look out from it, if you look offshore, you see that U.S. kinetic map with the pre-positioning ships offshore. So each of those 3 ships is provisioned to help in a case of HADR or fight a small war for 30 days. They've got everything you need. So if you're a planner and you look out there, you pat yourself on the back. Meanwhile, right in the downtown of the capital of the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, you have this massive Chinese-backed casino. It's closed, but it's just gone into, it has a very complex legal history, and the FBI has raided it. Nothing has happened. At one point, a former CIA director and a former FBI director on Louis Free and Woolsey were both on the board of, or the advisory board of this casino. Charges haven't been brought, even though all the all the files, but a lot of files have been taken out. And the money that's flowed into the system, this casino at one point was running more money than the casinos in Macau directly into the US banking system. And it was almost exclusively Chinese gamblers who were there. It distorted the politics and economics of the region. And you have a situation now where the delegate from the CNMI to the US Congress is pushing for a lifting of the caps on direct flights from mainland China so more Chinese can come into the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. Chinese now who come into the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas on short-term visas or on short-term visits do not need a visa. There's a kind of very basic EVS tap thing they have to fill out, but they do not need a visa. It's the only part of the US they do not need a visa. And they're not supposed to leave the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, but at least in the hundreds, they are illegally taking boats and going to Guam. Some have been found on US military bases. They're involved in sales and manufacture of drugs. Within the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, the woman that ran the Bureau of Motor Vehicles was convicted of selling US driver's licenses to Chinese, and they were using false US identity documents. It is a huge gap in a US understanding of the strategic importance of this area. And it is facilitated, and this is again something Captain Fennell mentioned, by economic distress. They need different economic options so that the people who are saying the only economic option for us is Chinese tourists are shown for what they are, which is not being willing to go after all these other options. And I think that in some cases, actually, some of those other options are deliberately at least slowed down or ignored by those who are pushing for the Chinese tourists only option. The governor of CNMI has been repeatedly requesting FBI investigators, Treasury, to come in and clean up Doge, whatever it is. There is a lot of money missing from the last administration in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and he wants it cleaned up. And this is the core of it. If we don't go after the strategic corruption in places like the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is the United States of America, and so it's not difficult, then that whole geographical pivot of history that cost so many lives the last time around is going to turn increasingly red. The Chinese will be able to go down from the bottom like we've seen and increasingly corrupting those into the heartland, and again be in a position to cut off the Americans who are in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Guam, American Samoa, and make it very difficult for the US to get across. Whoever controls that heartland of the America's real geographical pivot of history is in a position to strike a dagger into the heart of US defense and security. Next slide, please. This slide comes from Captain Fennell, just to show that the Chinese are not messing around. On the left is certain kind of naval assets in 2000, then naval assets 10 years later. I don't know if he's updated the map, but even this gives you a sense of how they're building up. And in 2008, Admiral Keating, who is then commander of PACOM, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that a senior Chinese officer suggested to him, you take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West. We'll share information and we'll save you all the trouble of deploying your naval forces west of Hawaii. This is something that President Roosevelt would have identified immediately as a very serious problem. What happened to the US during World War II was a failure to understand the importance of this geographic pivot of history to the US. But US strategic understanding of this goes back at least 200 years, and we're going to need to go back to that in order to put the pieces in place to be able to defend the Americans who live in the area and the people of the freely associated states who have been such help and support to the US during and since World War II, and to ensure that their security and US security and prosperity is viable. Next slide, please. This is how you say thank you in Chamorro. Chamorro is the language of the people of Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. It is an American language. And I highly recommend you go out and visit. It is a beautiful part of the United States of America, and it would be great if we got more American tourists rather than Chinese tourists. And if you want to bring business along and help build up the economy, even better. Thank you.
Leo, what a tour de force. Thank you for taking the time to go through this really masterful depiction, historic as well as very much contemporary, and looking forward. as well. We're going to have one more brief presentation by another of our duty contributors to these webinars, Colonel Grant Newsom is going to talk a little bit more about the principal means by which so much of what Cleo has just described is taking place, namely corruption, strategic corruption. Let's go to a video with Colonel Grant Newsom, also from our Securing America program.
The Pacific Islands and that Central Pacific, South Pacific, Southwest Pacific, and when you think about it, the way it's been treated for many years is like those old maps you would see in the Middle Ages when they would get beyond the coast, out, say, the coast of Europe, and they would then have question marks and dragons and waterfalls where the world ended. That's kind of how it was seen by both the U.S. military, U.S. civilians as well. It was just an area that nobody paid much attention to, didn't know much about it. You would have, of course, a few desk officers and a few officers and maybe some diplomats here and there who did, and they tried to get people's attention, but they really couldn't with any great success. In fact, that expression, benign neglect, which you hear about if you follow foreign affairs, was actually coined to describe the U.S. treatment of the freely associated states, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. It gives you some idea. When it came to the military, there was something called Operation Christmas Drop, when the Air Force would deliver presents by air, just drop them off onto small islands in the Central Pacific. And this was considered the great annual event, demonstrating that we really cared about the region. Overstating it a little, but not by much. But fortunately, in recent years, the U.S. military, particularly Indo-PACOM in Hawaii, has finally recognized the importance of the Central Pacific and is paying some real attention, finally. But this is something that has really only come up maybe in the last 5 years, and to be really generous, you might say 10. 5 years is probably better. But there's something else here to remember, is that you could get the military part right of the Pacific and say, like they're doing, you build airfields all over the place, you actually build ammunition storage areas, you have more people in the area training, exercising. You could do that and you could still lose if you don't pay attention to political warfare. You know, you build a nice $400 million runway on the island of Yap or on Tinian, and you find that you just might find that you built a very nice runway for the Chinese when they have actually gone about subverting the local political leadership in particular to draw it away from the United States. And that's a fight that takes place via political warfare. It doesn't take place with shooting. And you look at how the Chinese have insinuated themselves into the islands, all of them, over the last, say, 15, 20 years. And they have done it all without firing a shot. In fact, I would say the president of any Chinese-owned fishing company or timber company in these Pacific nations probably has more real influence than the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM, than a 4-star admiral. The Chinese guy, he's there all the time. He knows people. He's influencing. And not just at the very top levels. It's actually quite down very low in society as well. These guys are there. They're offering scholarships for people's children to come study in China. They're spreading money around. They offer jobs. And at the same time, they're, of course, bad-mouthing the United States and the free world as well. They're also encouraging separatist movements in parts of the Pacific, Federated States of Micronesia, the islands of Chuuk, that state, has been under Chinese assault for a long time, encouraging and stoking secessionist movements, and that's not the only place. Even on the U.S. territory of Saipan, the Chinese put together, they funded a group to study the future political status of Northern Marianas, CNMI, Northern Marianas, and what that means is think about getting away from the United States. So the Chinese are always there. You'll see that in the U.S. side, as I said, we're paying more attention, but it's really not staffed very well by the U.S. State Department. They do have some embassies, and they've talked about opening more. And then you find that there's a couple things. You still find that foreign service officers are not lining up in great numbers to get assigned to the Central Pacific. Everybody wants to go to Vienna and Paris with their sort of European living, but not everyone wants to line up and get assigned to that prize billet, say in Micronesia. There are some very good people out there. I would cite the U.S. ambassador in Palau is outstanding, and you just need to duplicate that and replicate it in an awful lot of places. Now, you've also got a problem, and we can always, let's say, well, we're not paying attention, we need to do more, and that's true. But if there's one thing that you could really do that's going to make a difference for the United States and the free world's position in the Pacific and all ends of it, Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, which also is an important point, that it gets across the distinctions between the regions, and too often we do treat it like the islands, the Pacific, but they're as different as North Africa is from South Africa, if you look into it. But the thing that we can really do to make a difference, and that is to provide help to people who want to have honest government, honest societies, free of particularly Chinese influence, is you go after the corruption, because that's the thing that greases everything. I talked about the local Chinese business guy, a business official having more influence than the commander at Indo-PACOM. Well, the reason he does, besides being there, is he pays it. And he's spreading money around. Go after that, and you've got to make a difference. First, you have to apply some intelligence resources to it. This is not hard to find in most of these places. They're not big societies. There's not many places to hide corruption. And in places like the freely associated states, the U.S. can help provide and offer investigators and sort of the forensic support that these places need. And you find that honest people there, and particularly in their governments, want the help. They want to be able to expose this, prosecute it where you can. Often you can find a U.S. nexus, a U.S. connection, which gives you some jurisdiction. Also, in other parts of the Pacific, well, maybe get the Australians to actually start going after corruption in places like Solomon Islands, where a lot of this money is moved through Australia, put into real estate. It's not as if the Australians don't know, but they think that somehow this gives them leverage by holding it over people. Well, it doesn't. But you have got to expose it in punishment, make so there's some cost for taking Chinese money. But first, you've got to pay attention. And so the FBI guys ought to be going out to the parts of the Pacific where they can. But as I said, it's an intelligence problem. Expose it and prosecute it. And that would do more than any number of F-35s.
Thank you, Colonel Grant Newsom, as always, for a spectacularly useful summary of the program, especially given the fact that you were doing it before the fact. It's very, very helpful indeed. I wanted just to mention, as I have on a couple of occasions previously, this book. It's entitled The Indictment. A friend and colleague Didi Laugesen and I wrote it basically from a compilation of the first 70 or so of these webinars. I believe we're up over 200 of them at this point, so we are in need of an update. But the subtext of it is we do need, as Colonel Newsom was just saying, to be prosecuting at a minimum in the court of public opinion, if not in, Article 3 courts, those in the Chinese Communist Party, and certainly their friends in America, who are aiding and abetting, enabling, really, Chinese crimes against America, China, and the world. I commend the book to you. It I think, helps take the argument that we've heard from Cleo and from Colonel Newsom, that we have to begin countering this corruption, systemic, comprehensive effort to capture elites here in the United States and elsewhere, including in what Claire so helpfully describes, and I think compellingly makes the case, is the pivot of history. So Claire, you are our only interlocutor for a little bit of question and answer. And thank you for, again, your presentation, but also sticking around to engage in it. Could I just ask one very simple and straightforward question. You showed on that image of the view of Saipan 3 pre-positioning ships packed to the, gunnels with lots of equipment and food and medicine and other things needed to essentially support combat operations, all of which it appears are in line of sight of a facility owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. That would seem to be a bad place to be parking these vessels if that's a permanent anchorage. Is that the case? And if so, what on earth are we thinking?
I have no idea. I mean, it's worse than that. The crew of those ships spends a lot of time on shore. Kids in Saipan will say, "We know something bad's happened somewhere in the world if the ships are gone." Like there's just this implicit assumption that everything is covered, that this region is secure, that underpins a lot of the, or has underpinned, I'm hoping it's changing now, and I think it is, a lot of the planning. There was a Tinian where those North Fields, where the North Field is, where the Enola Gay and all those B-29s took off from. Tinian is very close to Saipan, just you can see it. There's major military investments, at least in the hundreds of millions probably at this point, going in to rehabilitate those fields as a divert airfield. And it's a small island. Not a lot of people live there, and right on the dual use port, the little port where a lot of the equipment comes in and people come and go. The only building on that port is another little Chinese casino. Chinese linked casino. I mean, this is tricky, right? Because people will say, well, it's just a business, so we need business, so we need employees and all that stuff. And one of the issues is China's own 2017 national intelligence law, which says that any Chinese individual or Chinese company has to support Chinese intelligence efforts, or it can be punished or rewarded. If there is one Chinese national that's involved in that casino, and there are, then that's an issue, and it's right there. Everything is going past it. You don't know what's going on. It has a hotel affiliated with it. The reports are it closed. Now, I've heard recently in the last few days that there's still some activity going on there, so I don't know what's going on. And that's another problem, is you really need to be there and have the trust of locals in order to get a sense of what's going on, because this what Colonel Newsham was described about the Chinese strategic corruption and engagement in the region has created an atmosphere of fear locally. People, they're very tight-knit communities, and if you have one person in your extended family who had financial problems, wanted to pay for the healthcare of their parents or education of their kids, could have had perfectly fine motives, but ended up going into business with Chinese interests that have interests that are not aligned with U.S. interests, it can rip apart a family. And people who are on the wrong side of that already are ending up with their tires slashed, sometimes finding it difficult to get a job, socially ostracized. There are incredible Americans and Palauans and Marshallese and Micronesians who are fighting this fight, and it is tough. They are putting themselves individually in the way of Chinese expansion into the geographical pivot of American history. And if they don't get what they need to defend themselves, and all of it's stuff we should be doing anyways if we believe in transparency, accountability, human rights, rule of law, going after those casinos, going after that money, then you end up with all these pieces of very odd Chinese investments in strategically located places. This thing about the Tinian in Saipan, the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas has a population of about 40 or 50,000 people. This should be possible to figure out economic development with the support of the American government, block, the way I look at it is block and build. You have to block the Chinese, and I also like the Filipino term, illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive, ICAD, illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive Chinese activity. Yet that has to be blocked at the same time as you build up these economic alternatives so that people can live.
Clea, when we talk about many of these islands for which we have assumed, as you pointed out, full authority and responsibility, they're technically not American islands, at least in some cases. One that you mentioned that is, as I understand it, really crucial to our defense plans in the Western Pacific is a full-on American territory, Guam. You mentioned, I think, people coming from some of the neighboring islands without visas, without authorization, winding up in sensitive facilities. How would you characterize the security situation on that bit of American real estate specifically, and also the opportunity that it creates to move from there into the United States proper?
It's a major problem, and Guam's representative to Congress, Representative Moylan, has publicly asked for help to deal with this. There are a lot of people in the region who know their countries or territories better than anybody else, like David Penuelo, former President Penuelo in the Federated States of Micronesia, President Whips in Palau, Congressman Moylan, I mean, who are saying we need help. And apart from the physical infiltration, of course, Guam was targeted by Volt Typhoon, the cyber penetration of its critical infrastructure. And there's some say that China wants to not have to go kinetic, but if there's an aggressive attack on Taiwan, I could see it trying to be in a position to completely debilitate Guam, CNMI, any of those striking capacities before they can get off the ground. So and we've seen it. I mean, it's horrible to think about, but for example, in Afghanistan, what the Taliban did when they came in was they started killing the pilots, the U.S. trained pilots who had the capability to use what the U.S. had left behind to counter them. And you want to make sure that not only are your airfields secure, your airplanes are secure, but also that your people are secure, because they will be targeted. There will be the Chinese undoubtedly have a list of all of the key strategic people, so to speak, in Guam, in Commonwealth and Northern Marianas. And as you know, because of comprehensive national powers approach from Beijing, that definition of strategic is very wide. And it's better for them to get to the person and then be in a position to use the infrastructure for themselves later on than to. So I think the point of this is, I think apart from all of the kinetic warfare discussions that Captain Fennell, for example, discusses so eloquently, and why we need to rebuild the Navy and rebuild the industrial base, we also need to look at this completely different battlefield, which is this unrestricted warfare battlefield, which includes political warfare, that's allowed them to be in a position to jump that first and second island chain. And anytime anybody talks about the first or second island chain, if they also don't talk about securing that east-west corridor of freedom that allows the first and second island chain to exist, they forgot the message of World War II, which was you can have the Philippines and you can have Guam, but if you can't get there, it doesn't mean anything.
Clea, one other thing that I don't think you touched on, but if you did, I may have missed it, but could you just amplify on a point that we often hear when we talk about this part of the world, and particularly the threat that it now faces from the Chinese Communist Party, kinetic or pre-kinetic, and that is the importance of our allies in contributing to, well, deterrence in the first instance, and if it comes to it, the kind of correlation of forces. You mentioned comprehensive national power. You might say a further word about that too. But how does, say, Australia or New Zealand play, if at all, in sort of helping us with this pivot of history region that they're a lot closer to than we are?
I would argue that they're not. This is the U.S., so they're way down at the bottom. They have, in the same way that we've got this Eurocentrism in our head, there has been a very effective PR campaign by Australia and New Zealand to present themselves as being key to the Pacific Islands. As you saw from the presentation, they have no history in the Central Pacific. This, if you're from Yap, your great grandfather would have spoken Spanish, your grandfather German, your father Japanese, and you speak English. There's no Australia or New Zealand involved in there at all. The islands that are critical for Australia and New Zealand's security are below the equator, and that was one of the reasons why the Americans went down there initially. Also, Guadalcanal, for example, is to make sure that those supply lines to Australia and New Zealand were kept open. If you noticed, all that red on the map, those are areas where Australia and New Zealand said to the US, don't worry, we have it covered. They clearly don't. They put out press releases. I mean, you just saw, for example, with the Cook Islands, which is Cook Islanders hold New Zealand passports, New Zealand citizenship. But there's this fiction that it's an independent country, which was reinforced by the Biden administration, which said that it was an independent country. And that gave it the maneuverability to go and sign a deal with China. In the case of Solomon Islands, you have a very pro-PRC government that the Australians are giving over $100 million to them for policing. Their police minister owns a company in Singapore with a Chinese national and the son of the Solomon Islands prime minister who flipped the country from Taiwan to China. As far as I'm concerned, and a lot of that Chinese corruption money that flows through that region ends up, the leaders, they'll take the money from China. They don't want to spend it in China. They buy property on the gold, in Australia and New Zealand. They use Australian banks, New Zealand banks to launder their money until the Australians and New Zealanders start going after that Chinese corruption money that is undermining security in the Southern Pacific and that is being laundered through their financial systems. I don't take any of their protestations about how useful they are as an ally seriously.
You started this presentation, which again was extremely impressive, with a remark that was made to one of our former commanders of what I think at the time was called Pacific.
PACOM, Pacific Command.
Yeah. The Pacific would be, bifurcated with China taking west of Hawaii, with us being responsible for east of Hawaii. And for reasons that I think you've amply demonstrated, there's a lot more interesting things in the west of Hawaii. But
they're Americans west of Hawaii.
Yeah, exactly. Could you just talk a little bit about having leapt even further, arguably, past that third island chain, I guess, Hawaii, to the west coast of South America, and building now huge ports and installations there with the Belt and Road Initiative moniker that would enable them to cut our supply lines from, our own hemisphere as opposed to fighting it out in the Central Pacific. How does all of that bear on the pivot you're talking about?
I'm very grateful for the question. Chinese activity doesn't teleport from China to Latin America. It goes through the Pacific. It's all about that. In that context, I'd underline the role of American Samoa, which is the only part of the U.S. in the Southern Hemisphere. And it is right there in between China and Latin America, depending on where you're heading to in Latin America. So apart from all of this other stuff, and by the way, we've talked about this before, but it's worth bringing up again. When the Chinese operate, it's often a braided approach. So they'll say, we're here for commercial interests. We're going to help you build a port. There's usually, actually always a strategic component. The port just happens to fit PLA Navy specs. But there's that third element of corruption and criminality that comes along as well. They just happen to, have bought off the right people at that port to smuggle in. Usually, what we focus on mostly now is drugs, but they could be bringing in shoulder-fired missiles, whatever they want, right? Once they've got that whole system set up. And so what the Congresswoman from American Samoa said recently at one of the hearings was she's surrounded on three sides by countries that are very favorable to China, and she's worried about illegal fisheries and all that stuff, but the criminality in places like independent Samoa coming into her country and her part of the country and affecting that their social, economic, and political stability. So yes, it's Latin America, but it's flowing through the Pacific and it's affecting everything along the way. So when we look at, again, it's a mental map issue. When you look at China in Latin America, that is, again, a Pacific story.
Maybe this will be the last question. You mentioned fisheries. You mentioned these huge fishing fleets that are now reportedly sort of vacuuming up fisheries and the ocean areas of basically everything, impacting obviously the traditional fishing communities in many of these islands, as well as giving the Chinese another power projection capability, some armed, some not. What is your attitude towards this aspect of the Chinese unrestricted warfare, how it plays into the political warfare as well? I mean, I think it was Jim Finnell or maybe Colonel Newsom who talked about the influence that these fishing fleet captains might have relative to a four-star admiral, for example. Quickly, just walk us through how that plays into this and the corruption that may emanate from that as well.
First of all, for people in the Pacific Islands, fish have an emotional connection. So if you're in the Federated States of Micronesia, for example, many people belong to clans, and some of those clans are identified by marine animals. So you're a shark clan or you're a stingray clan, whatever it is. And so when the Chinese fisheries do this kind of rapacious sort of fishing, it actually hurts personally. And we hear it in Palau also. It's like an ancestor has been ripped from the sea, or a giant clam that you've watched grow for your entire lifetime suddenly disappears. So there's that emotional connection. But then, of course, obviously it has huge economic effect. And then from a pure Chinese perspective, the fishing fleet can be cover for other activity, as the Filipinos know very well. And so it's just not good. There's nothing good about it. And that's why, again, the Congresswoman from American Samoa has asked for a permanent Coast Guard station in American Samoa. Currently, the Coast Guard, which is great, but severely under equipped. They have, I think it's maybe about half a dozen ships to patrol an area about the size of the continental United States. So somebody once equated it to having half a dozen police cars to patrol the United States, and they only go 30 miles an hour. Right? They need help.
Cleo, I think so do you. And one of the things that I'd like to see come out of this particular conversation is not only a heightened awareness and also your testimony next week before this important commission, but also a redoubled appreciation of the importance of what you've specialized in most of your professional life, and help from those of us who now have a better sense by far of what the stakes are in this Central Pacific specifically, but in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare across the vast reaches of that ocean. I want to thank you for taking the time to share all of this with us. A dress rehearsal for you, perhaps a sneak preview for us of what you'll be telling the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission next week. Your testimonies before the Congress, your writings in the Sunday Guardian in India and so many other places are tremendously appreciated. And we need, as I'm fond of saying, to have you go forth and multiply. We hope you can count on us to be party to that effort. Thank you again. Thank you to Captain Fennell and Colonel Newsham, as always, for their contributions. The work of our friend Oleg Atbashin, who makes all of this possible. We will look forward to his posting a slightly cleaned up version of this in the next day or so. I entreat you folks to please help us get this particular program and all of our webinars around to others who have a need to know about the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party and the various ways in which they are trying to take us down and what we must do to protect ourselves and, I believe, the free world from their predations. With that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you again. Come back to us next week for another edition of our webinars on the CCP and its unrestricted warfare against America. God bless you all.